Portal 1 and Portal 2 are some of the most beloved games ever made. And I know its footprint isn't as blatant as it once used to be, since Valve is currently too busy making, seemingly nothing. But the impact that these two games had on the internet and video game culture for years and years was immense, to say the very least. Really though, when I got to playing it myself and was figuring out all of these mechanically awesome puzzles with one of the most unique tools in gaming history, I couldn't help but notice a few things out of the ordinary. Like, these stairways don't even have handrails. What if somebody fell and got hurt? Why are there no wet floor signs? The proper training for equipment, safety procedures, and work structure isn't a mandatory 5-hour part of the tutorial, and unless I forgot to read Amazon's newest employee handbook, I don't think it's kosher to gun down your employees with extreme prejudice. That one I am willing to concede ignorance on, though. So I decided, yeah, screw it. I have a weekend to burn, let's see what OSHA workplace violations this game decides to tear apart limb by limb. Little did I know that this wouldn't just take a weekend, it would take weeks. In plural. So you and me, we're going on a goddamn adventure today. But before that we do have to go ahead and do the mandatory clarifications. There are a few lore implications that kind of make reviewing OSHA violations fucky, for lack of a better word. For example, most height and fall-related safety precautions. There are a ton of them throughout this entire video. However, in both games you have specialized equipment that's so effective that it can protect the wearer from harm, even if they hypothetically fell for miles at terminal velocity. Of course, there's also the sci-fi shenanigans that we just have no possible way to really analyze in modern terms, because our scaffolds are not powered by beams of light, and are instead powered by many gears, and electricity, and mechanical bits, and John. And sadly, I really have no clue where the hell John fits in the Portal universe, so I'm going to have to do a lot of case-by-case verdicts here, especially for everything that revolves around training. Really, as much as I would love to say, well, everyone going into these tests are appropriately trained and equipped, so it's fine, I really can't. Even the application you can find and fill out online offers questions that range from completely standard, such as asking about your current living situation, or if you have any potential illnesses that may prevent you from working. And then there's just really fucking concerning questions, including, if you disappeared tomorrow, would anyone miss you? Which of the following describes your pain? Which interrogation technique do you think would be the most effective on you? And would anyone file a police report if you went missing? Point is, as much as I would love to give Aperture the benefit of the doubt, no. I mean, it's even flat out stated that they were aware of the laws that they were breaking, and had procedures on diverting and/or killing OSHA and other government officials. So for the most part, in contrast to similar videos I've made, I'm going to be extremely biased against Aperture, as the violations are acknowledged, yet safety amendments are never considered. And lastly, before we begin, this will only be covering the base games of Portal 1 and 2, although other lore will be referenced when applicable. And if spoiling an 11 and 15-year-old game is an unspeakable sin to you, I would highly advise clicking off the video. Hey, hi, sorry, I'm gonna barge in real quick. The day this video is published, I'm launching a merch store. So if you've ever wanted to purchase PNGs of my dog to slap on your favorite material items, wear apparel with this abomination on it, or a design that is, God forbid, actually relevant to this video that you're currently watching, feel free to check it out at daveygun.place. Yes, I am very proud of that link. Anyway, sorry for making the intro even longer, I love you, bye. Alrighty, so with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and boot up some Portal. Starting off, you're in a room which has a few features. There's a radio, toilet, bed, drink, and a hazard chart. Firstly, for plus, the toilet is operational, which is admittedly an incredibly low bar, but it is a bar nonetheless. However, there is one huge problem with the toilet that makes it a genuinely awful inclusion. So not only is a camera pointed at you at all times, but there's also an observation deck right by it. This is already not good, but what makes it even worse is the fact that you're not told that you are monitored until much later. And even then, it's indirect at best. And in Michigan, that is absolutely required, as it is an all-party consent state for audio and video recording. Although for video recordings in specific, it outlines that you can't record private places, as obviously outlawing all security cameras or recording systems would just be a complete nightmare, but I would really struggle to claim that a bathroom isn't a private place. Also, for future reference, anytime I display a law, standard, or regulation on screen, please note that for your sake and for mine, I am probably going to be cutting out a lot of the law for simplicity. You wouldn't/shouldn't ever do this, but specifically in the case of a dumb YouTube video, a lot of legal documents read like an artificial intelligence that's really early in development attempting to create a factual statement off of a prompt. Lines such as the oh so iconic, no contractor or subcontractor contracting for any part of the contract work aren't a rarity, and are in fact pretty freaking common. And I wish to speak like a normal human being who understands and feels emotions in some capacity, although I wouldn't blame you for thinking I wasn't one considering my vast vocal range. So we're going to go for abridged laws here. Anyways, on to the actual first test now. After like 800 years of preamble, a cube is dropped on the floor and it's your job to put it on a button. Now, one cool thing about the original Portal is that a lot of things damage you that otherwise don't in the sequel. Objects falling on top of you is one of those things. As more and more mechanics are introduced, there are going to be more and more instances of things not damaging Shell that realistically should either harm her, if not outright kill her, especially when we get to the sequel. But to go back to the cubes, it's more than possible for you to kill yourself in this first room. But, of course, the problem doesn't lie in Shell's capability to repeatedly bash her skull in with a heavy object. It lies in the lack of falling hazard protection. So, although there are signs on the floor that seem to indicate that an object is going to fall, that is nowhere near adequate protection. Firstly, if your employees are in an environment where falling objects may be a concern, take construction for example, you need to ensure that your employees are wearing adequate protective headgear. And since Portal's test chambers pretty frequently have falling objects, we're going to go ahead and say that Shell needs a damn hard hat. Secondly, you need to ensure that there is adequate protection around the drop-off point. However, what needs to change the most is not having very heavy objects fall in from an unprotected pipe meters above your personnel. I couldn't find a confirmed source on how heavy the cubes are. They don't appear to be too heavy, as you can flail them around pretty easily, and the noise they make upon impact isn't all too loud. Plus, OSHA doesn't really enforce a maximum carry weight, as that obviously varies wildly from job to job. And the portal gun you get very soon does have a built-in 0-point energy field manipulator, much like the one found in the gravity gun. Regardless though, you don't need a fucking Tom and Jerry anvil to potentially cause serious damage. A chunk of metal falling and making a direct impact on your skull can very easily cause an extremely minor case of serious brain damage, or possibly an outright fatality. This isn't something that should be transported haphazardly through pipes. And in fact, it's probably not legal for practically any object to be transported primarily through these pipes. It is really not a great system. Anyways, let's move on to the next room. I know my pace is just at a blistering speed right now, but I assure you the more concepts we get out of the way early on, the better the pacing will be for the rest of the video. Consider this a slow burn or whatever. Anyways, there's a big fall here. In Shell's case, this is kind of fine, as she has the required gear to not take any damage from falls, but generally this would be a safety hazard due to the lack of fall prevention or awareness. There are still signs here, but firstly, signs alone do not compensate for the complete lack of safety, protection, or awareness/training, and secondly, the signs in this series are just completely awful. Really, I couldn't go in depth with all of it, but for a very quick TLDR with tons of information withheld, specific signs should be in specific colors, signs should have specific text formatting and spacing, the wording needs to be concise to provide sufficient information and understanding, and whenever applicable, very specific and certain symbols should be used alongside them. So with all this combined, the aperture sign effectively abides by... actually, without hyperbole, these signs don't meet a single requirement. So... yeah, I got nothing. Anyways, I guess back on the point of gear. Although Shell does have long fall boots for fall protection, she doesn't really have anything else. So any laws relating or revolving around PPE are entirely violated. I still will briefly mention specific gear when it's applicable. However, since it's just a complete all-around failure, I am just going to inherently limit it to very brief mentions and nothing more. Anyways, in the next room, we finally unlock our beloved portal gun. Although I know for a fact there is some ridiculous stuff you can do with portals to kill yourself in virtually any scenario, I'm not going to fault a room if I have to watch a dedicated Portal channel talk about very obscure tech that no one will ever use in a standard playthrough in order to kill myself. Nothing against those channels, by the way. I love them to death, and although it is unrelated to Aperture, I've definitely watched my fair share of obscure Celeste tutorials because of the wacky shenanigans you can do with the game's physics. But rather surprisingly, OSHA doesn't have regulations against breaking the laws of the universe itself, and quite possibly the universe itself, so I guess it's fair game. For the portal gun itself though, its safety is debatable, but truthfully, the warnings and instructions you receive when you pick it up are very clear, so the only things I can really nitpick relate to protective gear and possibly some warnings and instructions on the gun itself. Other than that though, it's surprisingly not the worst. I will say that the level of sheer destruction you can commit with this thing is borderline astronomical, but in a controlled environment where you're unable to shoot the moon, or a different planet, or the bottom of the ocean, or what have you, it's kind of fun. Anyways, moving forward to the next room, This is where it gets really spicy, as there's yet another fall, as well as, God save my soul, stairs. I mean this with total sincerity. I could have made a video that's just why Aperture Science's stairs are the worst thing on the planet, and it would still almost be long enough for me to slot into mid-roll ads. They're all god-awful. So instead of covering every single one we see individually, we're going to go ahead and save the vast majority of that conversation for later. Anyways, on to test chamber 4. This room is just impeccable because it's the first room in which I can manage to commit suicide without bashing my skull against a heavy object repeatedly or breaking the space-time continuum. There is a falling object over a falling hazard, which is just a fantastic wombo combo for attempting suicide. Anyways, after beating this test chamber, GLaDOS will go ahead and tell you,
as part of our required test protocol, we will not monitor the next test chamber. You will be entirely on your own. Good luck.
It's revealed in that same exact test chamber that this statement is a lie.
As part of a required test protocol, our previous statement suggesting that we would not monitor this chamber was an outright fabrication.
Which is entirely illegal. Hell, when I was talking about the terrible toilet placement at the very beginning and mentioned that recording somebody in the workplace without their knowledge isn't very PogChamp, this is the conversation that reveals that you're being recorded. But it's just too little too late. Also, this doesn't add anything to the video, but you actually can manage to lock yourself outside of the exit, which would make the level impossible if GLaDOS didn't decide to help you out and remind you,
you're not a good person. You know that, right?
Like I said, it doesn't really add anything in particular, but I think it's pretty neat. Anyways, the next test chamber is when another new element is added in with these high energy pellets. Of course, despite GLaDOS's very clear warning, that still doesn't necessarily make this a safe or an acceptable thing. I could cite specific procedures such as lockout tagout for the control of hazardous energy, or maybe I could even qualify this as an exposed, energized part and cite that there should be protection around it. And on that note, it should have a very strict machine guard around it anyways, but just like a lot of things in Portal, this is so blatantly unsafe that just citing a procedure and going, hey, this isn't safe, here's what you should do, isn't enough. To make it safe and legal, you need to effectively remove it entirely. Especially by the time puzzles require you to bounce these things around or avoid them. There just isn't a fix that isn't get this the fuck out of our home. There's also a victory lift here, which I admittedly don't know if you can get crushed by or not, but I still get to tear into this a little bit because there's a lot more faults here than you would probably expect. So first and foremost, we're going to go ahead and consider the victory lift an elevator. I looked through some legal definitions, and although there are similar mechanisms, the elevator's legal description of a hoisting and lowering mechanism with a platform moving vertically serving 2 or more floors of a structure seems to be the most fitting here. I will say there is a case to be made for powered platforms, but either way, the safety regulations are going to be very similar for both. So firstly, ignoring the fact that elevators require routine inspections since Aperture just fails at that all around, one thing that needs to be displayed is the elevator's limitations and specifications. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Shell has some DeviantArt level obesity problem where she's going to fall through the platform, but for example, if equipment needed to be moved or multiple people were trying to use the elevator, a weight limit should be specified. The previously mentioned inspection results should also be posted, but I'll go ahead and just leave it at that so I can transition into the next few points. Secondly, I don't even know if I said firstly, but there needs to be either doors, gates, walls, bars, or equivalent protection around the elevator and its entrances. In order for your elevator to be legally automatic, you need it to have an interlocking door or gate system so people can't fall out of the elevator, fall down the elevator shaft when it isn't at their floor, or otherwise crush and dismember limbs when it's ascending or descending. And unfortunately, the only rails that this elevator has are so miraculously terrible that their existence doesn't qualify as safe or legal. And lastly, you do also need an easily accessible way for the elevator to cease movement, as well as generally a safe way to actually get on or off of it. And I know this and a few other platforms I'm going to talk about later have a brief pause when it finishes its ascension or descension. And again, due to its automatic nature, you need to have a closing and opening gate, which is currently not available here. And the weirdest part is they actually have this available with these elevators and this elevator found in the next game, which are both for the most part entirely legal, and I think really all the things I could fault here are the standard lack of inspections and signs and what have you. However, the people who would be the most qualified to take action or provide solutions here would be the elevator division of the state of Michigan. So I'm going to leave that to them so I can stop finding ways to rephrase this paragraph over and over and over again. This is also where a better or more professional scripter would say that regardless of the elevator's legality, most devices in Portal should have an emergency stop button or switch right away available and, have a clever way of transitioning that in. However, my brain is fried because elevator stun-locked me into an existence of confusion, so let me go ahead and set a precedent here. There are a lot of things that are overwhelmingly illegal and are present frequently or constantly in the games. However, instead of making the beginning a trillion paragraphs instead of a billion, I'm going to go ahead and cover them when I have something that can naturally transition into it. For a brief example, if your employee needs to leave, whether it be a restroom break, an emergency, or another various work incident, you need to be able to provide a means of egress, aka, you need to actually let your employees leave and not be stuck in a torturous testing chamber until they die. I think that's the legal definition in Michigan, but I could be wrong. Anyways, the next room is some more of the same. Unsafe stairs, no death pellets, and other various bads. However, for a new addition, there are now aperture science unstationary scaffolds. Now, two things real quick. Firstly, you can indeed perish if the scaffolding collides with you, which is obviously very bad. And although it isn't always instantaneous death, it's still exceptionally easy for you to harm yourself on this thing because of the very predictable lack of any guardrails, fences, appropriate entrances and exits, and other various nonsense. It's also much easier because of how the platform navigates. The platform moves backwards and forwards along a guided beam of energized light, which may very well be a safety issue, but one I can't necessarily bring up specific guidelines for. Everything I could bring up is more of a what if than anything else. But I think the thing that makes this surprisingly good is the early versions of these mechanisms. So for obvious reasons, I'm not going to mention development a whole lot here, but in previous versions of Portal, the scaffolding moved along a more traditional solid track, more akin to something that you would see in real life. However, players in development very quickly figured out that they could just skip the puzzles by walking along the track and ignoring the scaffolding entirely. So to make sure that wasn't an option, the developers went ahead and electrified the railings. So if a player attempted to walk along the track, they would just perish. However, that was too harsh of a turn, and ended up being very frustrating since all it took was one slip navigating onto or around the platform, and you would just die and have to go back to an old save or checkpoint. So eventually the developers moved on to the current iteration, replacing the solid track with a beam of light that wouldn't harm the player, but prevents players from cheesing their way through the test chambers and offers an incentive to avoid failure. So with this in mind, my thought process is that if this thing at one point had an iteration that harmed you, but was later replaced with a harmless variant, I'm more so leaning towards this being a harmless, safe, and legal beam of light rather than a secret and insidious killer. This isn't all too remarkable on its own, but beams of light or lasers similar to these are extremely common in aperture science, so I wanted to go ahead and set a precedent that I believe they are mostly harmless. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on to the next test chamber. Test chamber 8 is when acid is introduced and, acid kills you. I do need to say outright, there is not a single job in history that just casually has pools of acid just because. The reason for their existence here is so that testers have a penalty for failure. Do you know what employers usually have as an intended penalty for failure? A demotion, maybe a pay cut, perhaps even a suspension or dismissal of the employee. Granted, this is the US, so you can kind of just do any of that without fair reason anyways, but you know what I mean. Do you know what companies do not include as an intended penalty for failure? An endless abyss of acid that devours every material of your body upon contact and going, whoops, don't fall in. Are there dangerous materials or substances found in jobs or careers? Of course. Are there disasters that happen because of said dangerous materials or substances? Again, of course. But the key difference is that there is intent, there is purpose, there is a conceivable reason or plan for their existence, and when employees have to be around them in pretty much any capacity, there are tons of regulations and precautions that have to be taken. Perhaps even occupational safety and health administration regulations. It's not just, okay Jeffrey, you called in sick yesterday and you went to the hospital, but you forgot to bring a doctor's note in. Go ahead and jump into the death sludge, buckaroo. It's honestly difficult to really reference specific laws or regulations here. That's not to say that there aren't any relevant or applicable laws here. I could bring up hazardous waste operations, toxic and hazardous substance regulations, and so on and so forth. But generally the verdict should read something along the lines of, don't have a giant pool of death sludge so your employees live in a constant fear of failure that is closely followed by an extremely painful death. Although to loop this back to the initial test chamber, one of the funniest yet saddest parts about this is that, ironically, the beginning here is one of the only instances of legal invalid railings just existing at all. They're genuinely great, and I'd be able to happily commend Aperture on their existence, if it wasn't for the fact that the rest of the room exists in any capacity. On to the next test chamber though, it's actually the least interesting one thus far. There's no goop, there's no platforms, there's no high energy pellets, just fall protection failures all around. On the contrary though, the test chamber afterwards immediately starts with a violation. These stairs right here do not have a conceivable way to get on them without the portal gun. This isn't the Davey has a continued and violent aneurysm about stairs section of the video, but to briefly touch on one thing, if you have a break in elevation of 19 inches or more, you need to provide a staircase, ramp, ladder, or something along those lines. So, unless Portal was a game designed for ants, this is definitely way more than 19 inches. Also, completely off topic, but these grates really don't seem safe, but logistically I think they probably are. I don't see any immediate issues with them that would make them illegal since the grating seems to be well maintained, but it is such a big contrast that I can't help but feel that it shouldn't be there. I'm willing to wager that it might just be because of the ominous glowing red abyss, but that may just be me. Other than that though, this is the part in the game where you start having to maintain momentum in order to solve puzzles and proceed. I won't lie, this isn't strictly a Portal or Aperture issue as much as it is a gameplay issue, but I don't know how the long fall boots work with vertical or direct impacts. To repeat what I said earlier, you can literally fall for miles at terminal velocity, and as long as you have the long fall boots, you're entirely fine. But what would happen if you were to hit a wall, or even the ceiling? I'm going to go ahead and realistically assume death. But from a gameplay and player perspective, if that was the case, Portal would borderline just be an entirely different and way worse game. However, since you can still damage yourself with object physics, I'm going to go ahead and say that the long fall boots don't protect you from those impacts, and that makes these puzzles extremely dangerous. Granted, that makes every test chamber in the game with a vertical drop or pit dangerous, but I think we've went ahead and set that precedent a while ago. Anyways, I digress. The test chamber afterwards is when a wrench is going to be thrown into the mix. Not in the chamber itself, I don't really see anything too unethical about it that I haven't already discussed. But we gain access to our second portal, and this is when we can really start shenaniganizing. Although, once you unlock your second portal, you have to go ahead and solve a puzzle with a timed door, which could be potentially dangerous. And in fact, let's just go ahead and skip potentially there. They are dangerous, and could very realistically pose a crushing hazard and should have some form of protection in case somebody times their movement wrong. Afterwards though, we can go ahead and start doing test chambers in pseudo-lightning rounds, as more and more of them are going to have more and more of the same violations. So on to the next test chamber, there's more cube crushing hazards, there's more falls, unsafe stairs, and momentum shenanigans. Actually, future Davey is coming in for a second. I noticed while editing this segment that there was a brief flicker, and at first I thought that may have been a harmless lighting error, but then I saw these sparks, and decided to go back to investigate so I can potentially bust out the virtuous hands of the law. But, the sparks appear to be emanating out of thin air. I loaded this multiple times just to confirm it wasn't some weird camera angle, but no, the air just casually fucking explodes in a shower of sparks. I can't really bring up anything relevant here, so this entire edit has added absolutely nothing to either of our lives. Yay. Anyways, the next test chamber after that has high energy pellets, scaffolding nonsense, and even more cubes to potentially ruin our day. The test chamber after that one has a raising and lowering staircase, which in concept is fine, albeit pointless in pretty much every conceivable function. However, the rate in which it ascends/descends, and the lack of warning or security in assuring no one is on it before or during movement is not. It may be extremely easy for somebody to injure themselves if they're walking up or down the stairs. And this segment is kind of hard to script if I'm constantly acknowledging the fact that stairs inherently allow you to go up or down, so for the rest of this segment, I'm just going to say up. Basically, if you're going up the stairs and this thing begins to lower, without warning mind you, and you trip or otherwise lose balance, it's more than probable that due to the gaps in each riser that you could very easily lose a limb and or appendage. Also, there's just so much effort put into this entirely pointless and arbitrary staircase, and they still can't make a functioning handrail. Their priorities are about as straight as my sex life. Lastly, in this room all the way over here, there's platforming that is, air quote, incentivized by goo. For an extremely minuscule compliment in Aperture's favor, the platforms found here are grates instead of a solid surface, which does reduce the amount of water on it whenever it resurfaces, and as such provides a much safer platforming experience. I mean, after all, slips and falls have been the top violations in safety for over 10 years now. But, maybe we could avoid this entire conversation if we didn't have death pits that we needed to navigate. It's just a thought. On to the next test chamber, it's just more of these concepts combined. This right here is just an OSHA tragedy, but it's fairly standard. The next test chamber, though, I have to give you an informative lesson. Not just in occupational safety, but really just management in general. So, what do you do when a portion of a company has been promptly cut off, and you need to address the employees about their layoffs? Firstly, you always want to address that topic with great care. It is ultimately a decision and situation that impacts people's lives pretty significantly, and can be potentially devastating. But depending on the situation, you may be able to provide benefits or solutions for them after the bitter news. If the company isn't being shut down in one way or another, you could possibly ask if certain employees, typically the ones that are the top performers or the most valuable, if they are comfortable with transitioning to another position or role within the same company. Outplacement assistance can assist those who are laid off in finding another job in quite a few ways. Or if you want to, you can just give people severance packages. In a lot of places there aren't any requirements for it, but it's always nice to have some benefit carry on after your unemployment. Of course, some states or situations may not require this level of care and consideration, but do you know what is a thing that you cannot do in any fucking scenario? Period. Promptly replace your employee's workplace environment with a live military fire course for lethal automated turrets and tell them, hey buddy, just go ahead and run on in, you can't leave by the way. Despite the fact that GLaDOS was 100% lying when she said this was a replacement, look, I'm not necessarily an OSHA expert, but there are zero scenarios in which you can just legally gun down your innocent employees. That's just not a thing you can do. Ever. Just like goo, I'm not going to reference hazard communication, or how to go about handling abrasive wheels, or on a slightly more relevant note that a medical team should be on standby just in case Jenny, age 46 local grocery store manager, decides to no-scope Johnny, age 17 dumbass because he was in the bathroom for too long. Don't gun down your employees. That's it. Also, on a slightly relevant note, to be a bit meta real quick, this is where in scripting, I'm going to have to change how I'm writing and formatting this. Don't get me wrong, we're not going into Raid Shadow Legends or Davey Cooks Pancakes. I genuinely have no clue. I'm not a terrible cook, but I do not know how to cook pancakes despite the comment section of one of my videos being nothing but pancake recipes, but reviewing every test chamber, especially with Portal 2 on the horizon, is going to be years of me saying, goop bad. Forcing your employees to platform isn't good. High energy pellets should not be going brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr left. I think we've gotten to the point where you can understand the issues with a test chamber just by showing you an image. Or at the very least understanding why it's unsafe even if specific guidelines or violations aren't clear. So from here on out, we're still going to do this in chronological order, but I'm going to skip from point to point. It's debatable if I should have been doing this for the entire video, but I got a style and I think it works. It just needs to be mixed up a bit for both of our limited sanities. So here's Ratman. Or more specifically, his crazed ramblings and his dens where he wrote said crazed ramblings. I won't go too deep into the lore as, although he is very much the reason Shell is our protagonist, in terms of OSHA violations, he doesn't really add a whole lot. Should he have gotten Shell into testing despite very blatantly not being fit for testing? Absolutely not. Is it a crime? Yeah. However, in a hypothetical where Shell wasn't our protagonist, Doug wouldn't really contribute to the equation. I mean, he does stalk us through the entire game, and I'm sure to some degree you can flame him for not helping Shell, but in a nihilistic sense, I really don't know what he'd be able to do here. Also, I won't be covering the dens all too much. You do need to assure that all of the rooms and locations in your workplace are kept in a clean, orderly, and sanitary condition, but this is a den. A den where the walls are covered with the delusional yet justified ramblings of a paranoid schizophrenic attempting to survive in total isolation with no resources. The fact that it isn't worse for wear, or the fact that it is only disturbing and not a completely unmitigated horror film disaster is pretty good. I mean, hell, there's no waste anywhere, so Doug may actually be going to a bathroom and keeping Aperture a slightly cleaner and better place to be in, so good for him. Anyways, going through the game we now have access to the weighted companion cube. This little fella is just full of shenanigans, and I don't know how I'd go about assessing it. There are a ton of theories surrounding this thing, including theories that suggest that it may be alive and or conscious, or theories that suggest it's full of the bodies of past and deceased test subjects. And overall, there's just a lot of really bizarre quirks and mannerisms, and when combined with GLaDOS' dialogue,
The symptoms most commonly produced by enrichment center testing are superstition, perceiving inanimate objects as alive, and hallucinations. The enrichment center reminds you that the weighted companion cube will never threaten to stab you and, in fact, cannot speak. In the event that the weighted companion cube does speak, the enrichment center urges you to disregard its advice.
Dare I say it, makes this little thing incredibly sus. However, this is a rabbit hole and one that I don't think has a proper conclusion. But I guess for a worst case scenario, just don't kill employees and shove them into cubes. Also, if you were to do this, you probably shouldn't make that meat cube sentient. Also, you should record the deaths to the government and the families of the deceased. And you should probably ask them how they want to dispose of their loved ones' corpses before constructing the flesh cube and yeeting them into an incinerator. Speaking of which though, going further into the puzzles through the fire and the flames, we have to carry on and incinerate our beloved companion cube. It does actually survive, but oddly the incinerator is kind of alright. Despite possibly being one of the most gruesome deaths you could inflict on yourself, there are actually a ton of good things about this. You get very specific instructions and warnings by GLaDOS. You have to click the button to open it, so it's not just open always for you to just run into and die. And that's because it has a timer that automatically closes the incinerator after use. It does also have 2 caution warnings by it, and although the signs are incorrect, I do kind of appreciate them here. As a package, this is one of the very few things you could probably just throw in an informative sign or 2 and a door, and it would actually be perfectly legal as a room. This is one of the very few instances where Aperture shows proper restraint and care for its employees. It's pretty great stuff, truthfully. However, that doesn't last long, as the next test chamber is really just the video game equivalent of choosing all of the above on a question that does not support an all of the above answer. And coming up next on Disney Channel, there's a lot of lines that are generally just, hey, here's arbitrary safety information. Did you know that Aperture technology can remain safely operational up to 3,726 degrees Celsius? Make sure to go ahead and attend the Enrichment Center Electrical Safety Seminar. Perish. Now for an extreme hot take. Haha, unintentional pun. Incinerating your employees is not a morally fantastic thing to do. Do not incinerate your employees. Anyways, escape sequence. GLaDOS is predictably not very fond of your escape and lies to you. A lot. Well, she's been lying to you throughout the entire game, but here she's doing it for the explicit purpose of just murdering you. The original script had in cold blood, but that doesn't work here because she's, a robot. But I digress. Point is that some of those lies may have been potentially leading you to a painful suicide, but this one is just murder. Both of those are still illegal, mind you, but the former has lesser legal consequences. Other than that, there's a staircase here which, I mean, it seems to be perfectly legal. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's worse for wear, but in terms of actual structure, it seems to be entirely fine. Holy shit, did Aperture finally crack the code on... So firstly, the staircases need to have handrails or guardrails if they have 4 or more risers and or exceed 30 inches, which is the vast majority of stairs in this game. Specific staircases in particular are also much worse, as their lack of handrails make the staircases exposed in relation to the rest of the room, which is awful. Especially with how they're raised, that's a very real tripping hazard. That being said, stairs or a suitable alternative need to be provided if there's a break in elevation above 19 inches, which Aperture almost never abides by. There are also several times throughout the game where proper landings or platforms are not provided, especially with how many stairs directly lead to doors. Stairs need to be able to support at least 1,000 pounds at any given point, or at least 5 times the normal weight anticipated at any given moment. The tread depth is oftentimes much smaller than the minimum, which is usually 9 inches, which leads to stairs having way more treads than necessary and hence leads to a higher risk of falling or tripping. And also, you can only provide alternative staircases if you can feasibly demonstrate and prove that a traditional staircase isn't feasible, which is never the case as no such situations are prevalent. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the second game, though, alongside specific angles, and lastly, stairs may not be obstructed for any reason, and some stairs have very blatant obstacles either on them or in front of them which hinders traversal. I feel rather indifferent towards these stairs. On to the next room, or God knows how many rooms we're in now. These fans right here serve one purpose: to add in a slight amount of gameplay flair by having the player shoot a portal through a constantly rotating object. In any work-related sense, I can't see a single use this thing could potentially have. All of the other fans in the room that may be regulating heat are covered, so this one is really just for the player. Also, attempting to walk through it with the radio makes it automatically stop and emit sparks, so it's obviously not in good condition. I can't even really bust out the gameplay excuse for this one either. You have to shoot a portal to proceed anyways, so you would just carry the radio with you. And hell, even the goop that immediately dissolves almost everything can't destroy the radio. However, that one does make a little bit of sense, as it may be more than possible for you to drop your radio into the water unintentionally. This one was just added and programmed in for flair that most players won't even see, which is really cool, but also not very good in this scenario. Either way though, at the end of the day, it would be immediately reported because it's an exposed, fast, sharp metal fan that serves no purpose other than possibly removing a limb. But really, Portal has done this 800 times by now, and I'd honestly say that this is probably the least offensive example. Speaking of which, goop. Why is it here? I don't really know. Because it's not attached or otherwise connecting to a test chamber where, at the very least, you could bust out the excuse, granted a very poor excuse that it is an incentive for failure. It just wanted to be here, I guess. Afterwards, yet again, Aperture is back at it again with its classic comic antics. These rooms are just not well conceived and seemingly have no purpose. Maybe good level design, terrible employee design, and absolutely disastrous maintenance design. Also, ironically, this is one of the only automatic caution signs that would be handy for, like, any and possibly every other automatic mechanism in the entire game. But I will give Aperture credit. They did do it once, which is way better than doing it. I set up the sentence very awkwardly grammatically. You get the fucking point. Rocket turrets. Debatably better than getting shot to death with machine gun rounds, but still not ethical. I guess to be more specific, explosives are regulated pretty heavily, but really the regulations are more so for demolition, or other miscellaneous careers that utilize explosives and proper ways to store them away, or proper training and information that you have to give to employees. The laws do not account or correlate for an automatic turret with an infinite amount of deadly missiles automatically firing directly into employees, because OSHA shouldn't have to. GLaDOS. Now, GLaDOS as a character is just full of comic antics. I refrained from talking about the neurotoxin incident up to this point, just so I can talk about it here. So GLaDOS was a notoriously heated gamer, and was hence prone for heated gamer moments. She was activated several times, and after each activation, she attempted to kill every employee within Aperture Science within 1/10 of a picosecond. So they kept adding personality cores to her systems so she wouldn't attempt to kill them within 1/10 of a picosecond. And if you haven't heard of a picosecond, that is roughly 1/1,000,000th of a second. So, wouldn't you know it, one day she was awoken, and in the span of an entire 2 picoseconds, she flooded the entire facility with neurotoxin and completely locked it down, trapping everyone inside. Then she started taking hostages for testing and yada yada, Black Mesa, Ratman, Shell, Potato. Point is, personality cores and neurotoxin. This one is a little bit of a niche law that isn't brought up all too often in OSHA documentations, but you can't flood your entire facility with deadly neurotoxin and then take hostages. Also, the fact that Aperture even has deadly neurotoxin in the first place is debatable, much less so much deadly neurotoxin that it has the capability of flooding the entire facility with little to no preparation. That really heavily seems to indicate that there wasn't proper material storage. And of course all of this is replicated in this fight right here. Stick around and die in a few minutes from deadly neurotoxin, or alternatively get blasted by a big fuck-off rocket. Getting blasted off again is definitely the better way to go out. Hell, even GLaDOS agrees with that, but what if you just weren't getting murdered? That'd be nice. Anyways, when you triumph against her, it also destroys the entire room while launching you and the remnants of GLaDOS up into the sky. And really, I just have to ask why and how. Is it dramatic and cinematic? Yeah, and I think it's pretty damn cool. But how is this a result of what you did? I may just be overlooking something here, but in Lab Rat it was confirmed that when GLaDOS was, air quote, destroyed, that there was an explosion and the room shook itself to pieces. But that wouldn't result in this effect. Nitpicking a really cool cutscene and its implications is a little bit too nitpicky for me, but it's just very bizarre, and I'm sure in some way or another there's some OSHA violations going on here, but again, OSHA does not evaluate a workplace's ability to destroy the fabric of reality and physics itself, so I don't know. Anyways, Portal 2. Portal 2 opens up as all good games should. A completely abysmal physical and mental wellness exercise. It seems entirely pointless, but not really harmful or malicious in any way. Do you know what is harmful or malicious in some way? Wheatley. So Wheatley canonically is a core that was designed to be as idiotic as possible in order to generate an endless stream of terrible ideas. He was designed this way so he could be attached to GLaDOS to impair her mental abilities so she wouldn't attempt to kill everybody within 2 picoseconds. That obviously didn't really work out, but he's still here, so I'm sure we're going to see the inner machinations of his mind very soon. Also, it's pretty much the post-apocalypse now, as we were asleep for 9999999. What the hell that means in this context is confusing, but for a more concrete answer, supposedly the game now takes place roughly 50 to 50,000 years after the original. Now, that's a bit of a jump in time, and at this point the implications are pretty questionable. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into a theory that may have little relevance, so stick with me. So, it's more than common knowledge that Half-Life and Portal take place in the same universe canonically. And with Half-Life taking place in the 2000s, with this time skip in mind, it means that, for better and for worse, everything that has happened and probably will happen in the Half-Life universe has affected or will affect Aperture. And if you look at the Combine invasion, It is evident throughout the series that one of their main motivations is depleting Earth of its natural resources, including water. And to skip a pretty massive chunk into the future, when you look at Earth during the ending of Portal 2, you're going to quickly realize that the planet is very blue. Hell, it's still actually pretty green. And of course, if the entire planet was to be depleted of its natural resources, you wouldn't be alive. None of the plants you regularly see throughout the entire game would be alive, this potato wouldn't be alive, and neither would these birds. The point I want to try and get at is that, in some capacity, humanity is probably alive. Thriving? No, but things are still living and growing quite nicely. So I want to say, in some capacity, I'm going to assume that OSHA regulations may still be a thing. Old world knowledge, sure, I would be hard-pressed to consider it an active agency, but I'm just really happy thinking about this completely abysmal hypothetical situation where some guy, untold thousands of years into the future, is scavenging through an abandoned city in an attempt to find supplies, then finds OSHA documentations hidden deep under stone rubble, and over time begins to view them in the same light that we may view ancient literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. I may be alone on this, but I think that's humorous, so we're running with that theory. Back on topic though, there's a Wheatley here, which is always just a disastrous thing to say. Anyways, the reactor core is melting down now, which is less than ideal. Despite Wheatley's best attempt to do anything above the bare minimum and my best efforts to commit suicide, Shell just can't do it. However, in development, you may have actually been able to. So a very prominent idea was having multiple endings that would play if you died in extremely stupid ways.
Can't reset the death trap. Oh, could you just jump into that pit? Would you just jump into that pit for me? Just jump down, would you?
You really do have brain damage, don't you? I can't believe you came back.
Oh, wow, good. I didn't think that was gonna work.
One ending that was brought up was one that would play if you managed to die within the first 2 or 3 minutes. And judging the first few minutes of Portal's gameplay, it's safe to say that the ending would play out right here. Even if the beloved suicide ending were to make it in though, this entire sequence is just extremely dangerous and awful. Despite the fact that everyone here is either already a vegetable or dead, at best Wheatley is improperly disposing of and not recording the deaths of all the test subjects that he's mercilessly bashing through, and at worst Wheatley is committing excessive and indiscriminate mass manslaughter. Either way, you're not really looking at a particularly great scenario. Also, I hate to say it, but no amount of handrails is making this maneuverability okay. However, this is the point where I get to contradict myself entirely. No matter how dire a post-apocalypse may be, no matter the circumstances or what options there are, no living person would relegate themselves to living in Michigan. I'd also imagine if anybody were to put themselves through that masochism, if they ever dared to venture through the wreckages of Aperture Science, they'd probably be eradicated. Very quickly. Possibly painfully. What I'm getting at here is that we're going to go ahead and say that Aperture now fails at literally every single law that requires another person or persons. And the reason I bring it up here, despite the fact it was extremely prevalent in the first game as well, is firstly, the post-apocalypse, and secondly, at least in the first game, you had Doug following you around the entire time. Did he ever help you? No. Was he in the game files? No, but at least he was there. In a lore sense. But this time around, you are entirely on your own. Your one and only potential guardian is dead. You are in complete and utter isolation. God damn it. So this is going to be a lot of preamble, and I'm sorry, but it's going to be impossible to coherently script the beginning of Portal 2 without a billion side tangents, or adding every single tangent into the beginning of Portal 1, which is even worse. So let's go ahead and cover the most dire development of this entire time skip. In this brand new world, the toilet no longer thanks you for taking a shit. This really is just like George Orwell's Animal Crossing. Anyways, we're back to Portal 1 again, and admittedly, I'm not going to edit this part too heavily because it should be pretty blatant what the mistakes are. But to pinpoint specifics, this is debris. Debris needs to be removed at regular intervals, and judging by how much there is, and the fact that there is currently vegetation growing all over the place, I do not think that debris is being removed at regular intervals. And directly on that note, vegetation control is something that also needs to be involved. There also needs to be specific containers for said debris, in which there are currently none. Even the possible counterpoint of the Aperture Incinerator is nowhere to be seen. A lot of machinery is dangerously bursting with electricity and energy, which is a massive violation on the control of hazardous energy. Lockout tagout is no longer a thing in Portal 50K, apparently. The lighting is inadequate at best and virtually non-existent at worst. There's lots of protruding metal and broken down walls that make for tons of potential hazards. Lots of dust and fumes are spewing everywhere from the facility's instability, which could potentially be a massive health risk. The glass is so frail at this point that just walking into it or onto it will cause it to shatter and fly everywhere, which is just an unmitigated disaster for everyone in the vicinity. And you can definitely bet that, again, there isn't going to be a maintenance crew to pick up the debris. The fact that Shell immediately fell through the floor upon walking on it, despite probably being very good for player engagement and intrigue, is a very bad look for Aperture. Also, there is a ton of dirty water down here, and although a wet floor sign may be warranted, the wet floor sign usually has the indication that the floor is wet for a concernable reason. Like if somebody is using a mop to clean up the floor, or if you're approaching an area where water may be used in one way or another. But this is neither of those things. This is just a complete failure of drainage. To be fair, I'm sure Aperture never considered the possibility of multiple ceilings caving in and rainwater from the outside world flooding into the facility en masse, but they really should have considered that possibility before everyone died in 2 picoseconds. You need to have a dry floor in this environment. And really, I think that covers most of it in regards to the stability of the building. But goddammit, it wouldn't be a sequel if the worst part from the last game wasn't revised. But god fucking damn it, revise in this case doesn't mean improve because these are way worse than the old stairs, which is no. God fuck. Remember all the potential problems that these staircases had? With its immediate and sudden movement, lack of safety, and just overall blatantly terrible design? Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and take all those problems but compound on them. Because while these stairs had possible scenarios where you could lose an arm, leg, hand, or various limb, With this one, it may be possible to outright kill yourself because of the arms they're raised and lowered on. Unlike the last iteration, it's actually possible and feasible for you to crush yourself under the stairs. There's still no rails, and for first new controversy on the absolute horror that is Aperture Science's stairs, we have to actually analyze the degrees and angles because in a lot of senses, this isn't really a staircase. So the problem is that instead of a traditional staircase or instead of a traditional ramp, this design is trying to integrate both into the design, and in that regard, it just fails miserably. Not only is this a completely unsafe ramp because of these gaps, making it not only pointless but actively detrimental for any purposes or utility a ramp may have, but it also completely fucks up the staircase's attempt at being a staircase because of its slanted nature. And, miraculously, if someone, somehow, allowed this abomination of workplace safety into the world, it would be entirely irrelevant because if you're going for a more unique stairway design, such as a ship stairway or an alternating stairway, you need to be able to prove and demonstrate that it isn't feasible to provide standard stairs. And the reason I haven't brought this up for these stairs or during the grand stair aneurysm is, when these are raised, although some elements are missing and some safety precautions need to be taken, these are legally sound stairs. This, on the other hand, is just a complete abomination. Just go for stairs. Other than the terrible staircase fiasco, though, the rest of the test chambers are things that I've already covered, and it'll continue to be that way in just a minute, but first, GLaDOS. Now, I know it's the entire joke, but this room is just a complete nightmare. There's no coherent labels, no indicator of what does what, no signs explaining what the room is, and say for whatever reason you had to click the centermost lever on the 13th row, with this design that is entirely unfeasible. So, yeah, of course we ascend and all of the switches turn on, because of course they do. GLaDOS yeets us into hell. Obviously this entire section shouldn't exist, and now there's lasers. Well, it's officially dubbed a thermal discouragement beam, but that's just the politician's way of saying a deadly laser. So, yeah, the laser burns you. And there's a few issues here that we can't really pinpoint exactly. Firstly is whether or not the laser can potentially blind you or inflict permanent eye damage, and whether or not the laser emanates a certain threshold of radiation. And for both of these, yeah, I don't know if I need to know the exact levels. If you look at its interactions with various objects, I think it's really safe to say that's at an extremely unsafe level. Especially because you're going to be operating these things, operating in air quotes mind you, with your bare hands. It's not a very exceptional mechanism. However, that won't stop Portal 2 from running with its deadly laser puzzles. And pretty shortly after this, we'll run into aerial faith plates. Now, despite GLaDOS's very concerning and illegal information on their creation, these are pretty hard to categorize, and I'd honestly probably put them in their own unofficial category alongside the portal gun, where, without proper equipment, it is going to be exceptionally easy to slaughter people with this thing. However, due to the long fall boots and its set nature where it launches you to a specific destination at a specific pace and a specific height, it's actually hard to acknowledge this as a monumental threat. Of course it could be miscalibrated and launch people into the endless abyss of space, But truthfully, if Aperture were to leave these things in an offline or disabled state whenever they weren't in use, and had proper warnings near and around the area, this actually isn't all too bad. Obviously excluding the very unfortunate initial test subjects who were catapulted into space, these honestly are really well thought out and implemented all in all. There will be complications later, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyways, the mechanic we unlock after this is a hard light bridge. GLaDOS does warn us that it would set our hair on fire if we attempted to rub ourselves against it. Not in that way, you fucking idiot. But I really valiantly attempted to cut myself open with it, and I don't think it's possible. Since the bridge doesn't stop or cut off and you're in front of it, I am going to say that this is probably video game logic and it doesn't do damage because that would be a really tedious mechanic that players would hate, a la the scaffolding's beams of light. But as I've said previously, the amount of things in the Portal universe that canonically kill or severely injure people, yet seemingly bounce haphazardly off of shell, is exceptionally high. Especially by the time we get to the latter half of Portal 2. On the legality of the bridge itself, it is ultimately very, very niche. Although the bridge itself is sturdy, nice, and overall quite appealing, in regards to it actually being utilized, there's so many catches that can completely ruin its appeal. So firstly, any laws and regulations with moving the bridge, building the bridge, or overall maintenance of the bridge are kind of just gonzo. But secondly, and far more troubling, the conditions on where the bridge can be placed widely vary between a few centimeters off solid ground to dozens of feet in the air looming over an endless cesspool of lethal toxic substances. Or alternatively, you could go for a very inconvenient middle ground where you keep the bridge like 3 or 4 feet in the air and effectively annoy everyone who has to work around you. For general solution though, although it would make puzzles pretty damn boring, if you had set slots and spaces where you could build and maintain the bridges, this would genuinely be fantastic. Of course, proper fall protection should be included, but I could easily imagine a world where this would be actively utilized by construction workers as scaffolding. You'd effectively be able to eradicate most variables relating to elevation. You know, the main damn reason scaffolding is utilized? Transporting materials or personnel wouldn't be an issue. You'd be able to pretty freely adjust or remove the scaffolding with a literal press of a button, and you don't have to worry about maintenance or tearing it down. But just like most things Aperture has developed, its potentially groundbreaking and revolutionary real-world implications will never be seen, but instead, you're going to see it primarily utilized by test subjects who need to figure out how to utilize it to traverse over completely arbitrary ravines of death sludge. After that though, we're going to actually be cutting off a lot now, because like I said in Portal 1, these games tend to introduce mechanics, and then integrate them with previously introduced mechanics, then introduce an entirely brand new mechanic to overlap on top of the last mechanic ad infinitum. And with Portal 2 inherently being a sequel, and having a lot of the same themes and mechanics that the original had, they go for more of a slow burn so entirely new players can figure out the old mechanics naturally, and the new players can just go, oh, here's a never-before-seen element that is thrown into the mix. It's good game design, but particularly for this video, we're going to be skipping around a lot. So with that, we're actually going to be skipping all the way to the escape sequence, which is just a series of increasingly dangerous events. I mentioned it previously here, but illumination is starting to become a very real issue. Your employees need to be able to see what's in front of them, and if you can hardly see what's in front of you while you're traversing over an endless abyss, that's a bit of a problem. But besides that, it's more of the same. GLaDOS is here, she has this comic antic, we go ahead and plug Wheatley in, he gets a tad bit mad with power, stops our ascent to the surface, and sends us back to testing. But, look, real talk, at this point if you're currently thinking to yourself, wow, Portal 2 is being a bit samey so far, I'm kind of on the same page. However, imagine all the violations that GLaDOS had as a meticulous, albeit insane and murderous AI, and then give that same level of power to an intelligence who was designed to be as idiotic as possible. We're going to be getting into some real crazy shit soon. But first, we gotta get through Cave Johnson's bizarre adventure. And that sentence kind of has undertones that Cave Johnson may be better, but Cave Johnson is the OSHA violation. One of the very first dialogues you hear from him is instructing people to fight against an army of mantis men that were created when he decided to inject people with praying mantis DNA. This is less so of an OSHA violation, but rather a crime against humanity at this point. But it's only going to get worse, trust me, we have a lot to go. So now we have to go ahead and mess with gel, specifically starting with repulsion gel. Firstly, Cave Johnson says that the last guy to get in this control group very quickly broke all of the bones in his body, and very shortly afterwards the lab boys told him that he shouldn't be so honest and outspoken about their concealed test subjects' frequent and undocumented deaths. This entire sequence of events isn't particularly poggers, or whatever I need to say to get my 13 to 17-year-old age demographic up. And speaking of which, this is actually miraculous considering everything we've covered, but the repulsion gel is by far the most malicious and terrible thing that Aperture has thrown at us thus far. Worse than lasers, worse than goop, and God forbid quite possibly worse than the fucking stairs. So, I'm just going to go ahead and play Cave Johnson's dialogue here.
For this next test, we put nanoparticles in the gel. In layman's terms, that's a billion little gizmos that are going to travel into your bloodstream and pump experimental genes and RNA molecules and so forth into your tumors. Now, maybe you don't have any tumors. Well, don't worry. If you sat on a folding chair in the lobby and weren't wearing lead underpants, we took care of that too. Oh, in case you got covered in that repulsion gel, here's some advice the lab boys gave me. Do not get covered in the repulsion gel. We haven't entirely nailed down what element it is yet, but I'll tell you this, it's a lively one, and it does not like the human skeleton.
So, firstly, for a lot of this segment, I'm actually just going to go ahead and let Cave Johnson do the talking because literally nothing I can say will match his charisma and his dialogue. So for a few things that are pretty blatant, 1, there is absolutely no visible information or classification on this substance. We didn't even know what it was or how it interacted with us until we started using it, and by that point it could be all too late. And this could've / should've been mentioned way earlier, but I don't think there's a single NFPA diamond in the entire series. Secondly, obviously not only do we have zero protective gear against any hazards of this variety, but we also have no good way of handling it or cleaning it. And very relevantly, thirdly, the way it's transported and its method of being utilized is entirely unsafe. So imagine all the issues that I mentioned with the cubes at the beginning of Portal 1, but instead of it being a potentially harmful heavy object, go ahead and replace it with a liquid which has a capability of literally fucking melting you that is just being haphazardly sprayed all over the place like a Midwestern gas station. It's still not a great system. And I know people will mention that you don't take damage from it, but I don't care. At this point, Shell is practically immortal to things that would otherwise kill the average person dozens of times over. It's video game logic, and they're obviously not going to take a mechanic that's sole purpose is to be spread across any and every surface imaginable, and decide that you should take damage upon contact with it. That's fucking psychotic. But to wrap this segment up, this just violates everything, really. Just type the words OSHA hazardous materials onto Google and make sure you're on a reliable government website, and effectively every law or standard there is violated. Transportation? Nah. Labeling? No. Containers? What for? Are employees trained for this, or have they even really signed up for this? Why would we give them incriminating evidence before they're under our control? Safety procedures? Those are so 1940s. Recording incidents? Yeah, we do that. Do we do anything legal with it? No. Why would we do that? That's devastating to our case. And miraculously, there's going to be a much worse problem that's relevant here, but as implied, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But truthfully, everything I just said pretty much just applies to the next gel, and the gel after that, so I'm going to shorten all this down when we get to them. Anyways, after that, there's a pretty lengthy jump in time. At least for Aperture. And Cave Johnson went from hiring the best of humanity to random homeless people for $60. And in case you're wondering what that equates to nowadays with inflation, or how that compares in your currency, here's some numbers for you. I obviously can't translate this to every currency, but I at least hope that this should suffice. All this dialogue indicates that they kinda just found homeless people and threw them into the ring. No training, no information or classes, no clue what they're actually doing, just sign a contract that more than likely will result in their death, possibly a painful death, so they can probably die before they get their oh so delicate $60. Woot. Propulsion gel is also here, and although realistically I have no clue if it's as lethal as repulsion, it is described as largely non-toxic, which when compared to the last product, isn't really saying much. Oh yeah, I actually didn't mention this yet, but the repulsion gel's intention was to be a dietetic pudding substitute which caused ingested food to bounce off of the lining of the stomach, which in turn would lead to it bouncing out of the consumer's mouth soon after. Miraculously, the product still made it to shelves, but it was very quickly pulled from them shortly thereafter. But of course, this wasn't going to be Aperture's only rodeo, as the propulsion gel was another attempt on a similar idea. This time being a product that you ingested that was supposed to let food slide through your body without absorbing any calories. But, who would have guessed, digestion is kind of important, and this ended up not being very healthy. It also didn't help that the people who were the most likely to want a product like this were already struggling with a relationship with food, so it was also very quickly pulled off of the shelves. But anyways, just like repulsion gel, although you can't die from contact in-game, it still should have all the laws with handling, qualification, information, specifications, storage, and other such nonsense. Also in Cave Johnson's OSHA workplace violation checklist, He is now literally just asking people if they're desperate enough for money to donate their organs. And to be completely cynical, despite his warnings saying that it's safe, I really wouldn't doubt it if it would just result in the patient's death. I mean, think about it. Aperture gets scientific data, valuable organs costing tens of thousands. They don't have to worry about the possibility of the person telling authorities about their very illegal operations, and most importantly, they get to save $60. It's a win-win. For Cave Johnson, mind you, not for anybody else, but a win-win nonetheless. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that GLaDOS is a potato now. Is it evident by this point that my scripting process may be very sporadic and uncoordinated? Anyways, her newfound state as a starch isn't all too important. But the fact that she's laying in a bird's nest, in an office space where birds seemingly just freely roam, is incredibly unsafe. If you really want to play devil's advocate, technically OSHA doesn't have standards prohibiting pets in the workplace, and most states likewise have pretty loose laws with service animals. But this is not a pet. This is a pest. And in Michigan, animals must be removed from the premises if it's out of control. And regardless of her rampant homicidal tendencies, I would consider an animal attempting to deal significant or possibly irreversible damage to an artificial intelligence that is a technological marvel a pest. Moving forward though, here's a new type of gel. But this one is miraculously even more lethal than any of the other ones discussed thus far. This is conversion gel. I'm not going to make the obvious jokes, this is a family-friendly channel for families of all ages, but conversion gel is made up of ground-up moon rocks which are extremely poisonous and make people deathly ill. At least in the game, I don't think they are in real life.
The bean counters told me we literally could not afford to buy $7 worth of moon rocks, much less 70 million. Bought them anyway, ground them up, mixed them into a gel. And guess what? Ground up moon rocks are pure poison. I am deathly ill.
So, obviously everything I've previously mentioned with the gels are applicable here. However, this one is even worse than those previously mentioned, as you don't even need to make contact with the gel for it to kill you. Even if you're standing far away from it, it can and probably will take your life. And in a pretty sad way too. Say what you will about the last two gels, although the fatalities induced by it would be cruel and unusual, at least it was relatively quick. This one just sucks, and I'm not going to say that it makes it more important to contain because realistically all of these should have proper containers regardless, but it's definitely the most unsafe. Also, conveniently enough, pipes are just starting to burst a lot more frequently, which is just lovely. I briefly commented on it in the last game, where I said that the facility's pipe durability may be a concern, but now, I just love the concept that the lethal chemicals that can instantly kill me upon contact, or slowly kill me just by being around them, are being spewed sporadically all over the place. And, you know, even more sporadically than the lethal chemicals that can instantly kill me upon contact or slowly kill me just by being around them that were being spewed sporadically all over the place from earlier. Also, fuck it, I'm just going to reference every other Cave Johnson line because I'm tired of segueing into his wacky antics. Employees are now forced into mandatory test participation, which obviously led to a lot of deaths and is entirely illegal. But don't you worry guys, human testing is getting phased out soon. Woo hell. He threatens life itself with arson. You can't convert somebody's blood into pure gasoline. Despite getting +2 points for finally allowing people a means of egress to go to the restroom, the terms and conditions shouldn't mean that they have to piss coal in order to do so. Weaponizing peanut allergies is on brand, but you also can't turn somebody's blood into peanut water. You can't hit your employees with jet engines, and you can't teleport employees in a process that skins them alive. Is that all? Let's see, Perpetual Testing Initiative. I'm not discussing this. No, I am not fucking discussing this. No joke, I could have made an entirely different spin-off sequel video titled Cave Johnson's Innumerable Crimes Against Humanity, and it may have been a similar length to this entire fucking game. This isn't even going for the algorithm bait. I'm not going, hey guys, make sure to like and subscribe and tell me if you want this, and if we get to 10 billion likes, no, fuck you, there is no we, it's just me. I have closely read and analyzed over 10,000 fucking Pokédex entries, and somehow I feel like I'd rather do that all over again than dissect this, because I don't think I could ever explain to potentially thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people why, for whatever reason, killing Parallel Universe Hitler is not recommended, and is in fact scolded. I don't fucking want the K-On! Profile picture users with the naming format of first name birth year to try and actually me and engage me in an intellectual debate. Hitler shouldn't be kept alive in any fucking universe where Cave Johnson is involved in any capacity. And I wish I was following a script. I wish I could, pull a funny comic antic like, oh, I'm sorry for lashing out. No, there is no script. We're doing this live. I don't care. Whatever. I guess while we're on a similar topic, let me just go ahead and have the Davey talks about dialogue that he wasn't able to transition into naturally, but can now fit in because he is evidently dying from an extremely minor case of serious brain damage segment. GLaDOS confirms that every room in the facility past a certain depth doesn't contain real oxygen since that costs too much money. It instead contains, quote, freshened carbon dioxide, which I'm not really all too sure if it's illegal, but truthfully, if it's something unorthodox that saves Aperture money, it's safe to say that it probably is. Also, specifically for Portal 1, there have been multiple times where GLaDOS' instructions were cut out very quickly, which not only leaves us clueless on potentially vital information, but this animation tends to play alongside it, which, again, isn't very cool. GLaDOS also lies about the possibility of escape, which is bad because you need to be able to provide a means of egress as previously discussed. However, she also lies to you about the possibility of a rescue team, or otherwise the possibility of your injuries being treated or examined by qualified personnel, which isn't feasible. Wheatley does this as well later on, but we'll get there when we get there. Animals were tested unethically, which, to be fair, I'm sure was a given, but I thought it deserved a mention. And there's also a few warnings that seem suspiciously specific, including the possibility of the material emancipation grill destroying the ear tubes inside your head and causing heavy internal bleeding, which probably isn't the type of thing you should just casually deploy in almost every test chamber. And I guess to get off of the dialogue note now, for another thing I forgot to mention, I never covered hearing protection in this entire video, mostly because hardly anything PPE related has been discussed in depth, but it's safe to say that this right here could very easily cause permanent damage. At the very least, earmuffs or earplugs should be required to open this thing, and I guess to be fair, it should probably just be required for the entire game anyways, but I'm mentioning it now. I don't even know what the original point was, and at this point I'm just transitioning into the rest of the game because I've lost control of the script and my life. Wheatley is now well into the process of blowing up the entire facility. I really don't know if I mentioned that in the dialogue part, but blowing up your entire facility that spans thousands, if not potentially tens of thousands of square miles is going straight into the F tier with Hitler. You shouldn't do that. These things are things that exist now. I'm going to assume that these rotating things probably shouldn't be rotating without protection, and all the laws with fall protection are still valid because there isn't really a safe way off of this that isn't just hope you don't break your legs and your spine by falling down 30 feet or possibly 30 miles. Also, you know what? Pause. Why does falling down kill you? Yeah, I know, from a gameplay sense it'd be really boring and whatever, but this entire video I've been talking about how many things should realistically kill Shell or otherwise cause permanent damage to her, and I think this is the one and only time where I can claim the opposite. This is goddamn shenaniganizing. Also, as always, Wheatley is not properly disposing of the deceased, but at this point, sure, why not? Look, if you're going to android/robot hell for killing somebody, which canonically exists according to GLaDOS, who has been nothing but a reputable source for this entire video, why not just go all out? If you know you're going to burn for all eternity for something you've already done, just double down and commit even bigger sins and crimes against humanity. I don't know, at this point I almost have to concede to first name birth year. It almost makes sense why Cave Johnson didn't want us to kill AU Hitler. These are things that I hope I never say in my entire life, but unfortunately, I was given a platform, and unfortunately for the both of us, that platform wasn't designed for execution, so I'm stuck talking about the ethics of an indirect Cave X Adolf fanfiction. The Aperture computers, just like my brain, is currently blue screening, as the neutron multiplication rate appears to be at its spike value of 999,999,999,999. Press any key to vent radiological emissions into atmosphere. Consult reactor core manual for proper maintenance. You're funny, game. I don't like you. This is the part where he kills you. That was the part where he kills you. Here's another part where he kills you. There are quite a few parts where he kills you. He also lies and tries to get you to commit suicide, which, honestly, at that point I can't really fault Wheatley. He's just putting natural selection at work. Although at this point in time I appear to be full of hot takes, in all seriousness, if your boss ever tells you to commit suicide or actively advocates for it, don't. Contact whoever you need to at that point in time, and for that matter, your life matters. Regardless of how depressed, angry, or empty you may feel currently, the world is going to be a brighter and better place with you in it. Things are going to be better soon. And those seemingly distant admirations that you feel may never be achievable, may be a lot closer than you expect. Just make sure to take care of yourself both physically and mentally. It's alright to make mistakes, and it's alright to fail. It's only human. So make sure to relax and take it easy on yourself, because despite what you may think, a lot of people believe in you. And I genuinely hope that you stick around with us for those brighter days coming soon. Unless you're Wheatley, in which case I actively encourage you to perish. Wheatley is a pretty neat variation of the first boss fight, but now there's fire and now there's grenades. At the very least, the fire protection services are functional and are actively being utilized, so that's good, I guess. The button that we have to press in order to end the fight is trapped, and Wheatley is surprised that this wasn't the part where he killed us. We go ahead and casually portal the moon. Wheatley is gonzo. This is the part where GLaDOS doesn't kill us. End credits. So, at the end of all this, I don't really have a proper conclusion. Instead of citing what was illegal in Portal and giving you a really cool ending, let me go ahead and summarize what I found that was almost mostly legal. They got kinda close with that elevator. From time to time they figured out what rails were. During that last fight, the fire sprinklers did turn on. The boots are neat, and made a lot of usually lethal and horrendously unsafe areas into easily traversable zones. They had a toilet that thanked you when you shat in it. Yeah, I'm really running on empty here. I don't have enough willpower to properly segue into the outro, so here's Patreon. As always, a big thank you to all of my patrons for funding these abominations. At this current period, those patrons happen to be Just a Plaid Shirt, Dan White, Black Jade, Parabellum, Aiden, Jacob S, Michael P, Breadman, Catapult Man 1, Chair, Judge and Jury, Wubkitten, Skarner Crystalline, Teddy Bear Guy, Minister of Sauces, Cray, Mr. Bones, Frequent, Pyromusical, No Goat, Vegeta, and Blazeheart. As always, your support means a lot, especially because this fucking video took exponentially longer than I ever could have anticipated. And this video is not sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. Do not use code Gunface because I promise you, you will get nothing. If you feel like it though, feel free to go to daveygun.place to purchase some bug and bug accessories or other various nonsense I'll publish over time. And that's gonna be it. XOXO, love you lots, bye bye.